Welcome to Neuro Revolution. The world was not designed for us, so we are creating a new one. Hear the stories of neurodivergent entrepreneurs, creatives, and changemakers. The rebel minds changing the world. Welcome to this week's episode, where I am talking with Zero, who is a psychotherapist at Liberation Therapist and executive director of the Letting Go Project, which supports conscious dying, bringing deeply attuned and safe presence to those experiencing death. Welcome. I know I only touched on your roles, but is there anything else you'd like to share about you as your person, your identities, as we begin?
Not in the moment, I don't think. I think that whatever needs to be revealed probably will be.
Okay, beautiful. One of the things that we're doing here, right, is highlighting the stories of neurodivergent folks. And you have been very open about that in the different places where you write and you express yourself. And so, if you would like to share a little bit about your journey of your own discovery of your neurodivergence.
Yeah, it took me a really long time. Actually, I was working with neurodiverse people as a therapist. Being a trans non-binary therapist, I work with a lot of other trans non-binary people, and oftentimes we are also neurodiverse. We are also often autistic. The two overlap greatly, and I started to see myself, and I was like, oh wait. And I started to put together this picture, and it was very interesting because when I was putting together the picture of my own autism, I was also acknowledging white supremacy culture and how people were expecting me to perform. And that was easier for me to identify more immediately, actually. And then I started to see how intrinsically linked um, my failure to participate in the culture as an autistic person was to the expectation that I should engage in white supremacy culture, and specifically I should perform white womanhood. And I was never really capable of that. I didn't exactly get the rule book. I had no idea what it was. Like many autistic people, we feel like we didn't get the rule book for a lot of things.
Yeah.
Um, and I was always feeling this sort of social tension, which I internalized in a lot of ways as being about me being deviant or me being like difficult. And and yet like when people would point out how difficult I was being, I never felt any charge in my body, or I wasn't upset, and I couldn't figure out kind of like couldn't match the two. And yeah, so through my own journey of unpacking race, gender, and ethnicity, I kind of, and working with people in that intersection, I discovered that I am also autistic. So these things for me are sort of deeply related and overlap. And interestingly enough, I find that death does too, and especially when we talk like around gender. Um, my journey around death care was very much a journey around transness and gender, and finding out, and as a Buddhist, and sort of exploring gender and identity and unpacking it and letting my ideas about who I was supposed to be, or letting other people's ideas about who I'm supposed to be die, so that I could be who I needed to be in any given moment. And so those things really all kind of coalesced and came together.
Thank you so much for sharing. We're gonna, if you would like, we're gonna get into all these different things. There's so much here to touch on, and I really appreciate you saying that about like the dying of to an identity, or like what was projected upon you, and it just really resonates. um,
Death is both like individual and social, and collective. It's both. And so anytime we die in a what we call those little deaths in our life, or the big death, it's both a relational experience and a personal one.
I probably jumping into the middle of the conversation, but I would really like to talk a little bit about um, your experience of like supporting neurodivergent folks around the topic of death, and it could be right a death to identity, or even like them experiencing death of people in their life.
Wow. Well, I kind of like obviously anticipating some conversation around that. Was sort of sitting with that and contemplating that myself in the last week or so, and how complex it is, because we exist on a spectrum, you know? There's a spectrum of experiencing, and I think that that spectrum is also influenced by race, ethnicity, and gender, and how those things show up for each autistic person, plus their specific neurotype. It creates so much variability that it feels sometimes hard to talk about. Um, with that said, so I can make some generalizations about how we do grief, how we relate to death, and also how that all ties into ritual, because that's such an important part of death and dying, actually. So some of the things that emerged for me as I was contemplating this, um, is that, yeah, I think that autistic people, I think I'd be speaking too broad if I said neurodivergent people, but I think
Yeah.
autistic people specifically um, grieve differently, process things in on a different timeline, um, exist on a different timeline, uh, generally in the world, and often need time to sit with and to allow the grief to move through their system. And I think this is true for everybody, but more so true of autistic people. Um, we need time, and we may not be demonstrative about our grief initially. Um, we may not be showing that we are grieving in ways that are socially approved ever. Or if we do, it could take us a year to get there or 20 years,
Mm.
um, realistically. Like our process is very unique, and we don't have a lot of supports around grief, um, both in the culture and as autistic people. So I think that's one of the things to mention is that our timeline looks different and our affect states are going to look different for two holistic people. I'm going to take a pause there and see if you have any
Yeah.
I go on
I'm,
because there's a lot more I can think of worth mentioning.
I'm just kind of in this moment pondering how much I want to personally share. Because I can feel the emotion coming up
Mm.
around this topic. Um, but I really appreciate you sharing that about how it can look so different. Um, and why there's emotion is that I had a personal loss this year that was really significant. Um, and it was an interesting experience of, like you're saying, having a very unique approach to it, experience of it, moving with it, um, that doesn't really align necessarily with like what one would expect. And I think in that as well, there were elements of realizing just how much myself as an autistic person can struggle with transitions of even just like
Mm-hmm.
sort of processing that something so huge changed.
Yeah, this was a piece that I wanted to talk about actually,
Yeah.
about this sort of struggle with ambiguity as autistic people.
Mm.
Uh, with like, this is true for some, not all autistic people. I love ambiguity personally, but I know a lot of autistic people I work with, both in the death care community and in my personal psychotherapy work, really struggle with ambiguity and loss.
Mm.
Uh, and some of the things I see often are like looping because there's no ground, there's no place to understand this. So there's a looping of grief, which is
Mm.
really intense and really challenging. And I think this is where our natural instinct to move towards ritual and ritual soothing, and I'm going to say it in that way because that's exactly what ritual is. It's soothing. It is meant to soothe our nervous systems, and it is meant to create social solidity at a time during a time of uncertainty and change. Um,
Mm.
in like a historical sense, like to ensure that our tribe, our group doesn't sort of fall apart. Um, so but we're mavericks at it. We're the best at ritual.
Tell me
And
about that. Okay.
yeah, I think this is one of the places that we can really we can really use our innate skill
Mm.
towards self-soothing and towards wanting to move towards patterns of ritual. So I
Mm.
think the first thing is that we have to maintain our usual structure, um, and like maintain our usual rhythms in our lives. And that we can also grieve ritualistically and in rhythm. When my father died, I noticed a couple of things happen. He died a couple years ago. Um, I ritualistically grieved him, and I didn't ask for permission to do that. My body knew what to do. And I
Mm.
think our bodies do. And I think that's even more so true of autistic people who are great at ritual. And they're great at creating ritual through themselves. And so, yeah, when my father died, I immediately had the impulse to work with clay. And I had worked with clay since I was like 11. And I was like, I have to put my hands in some clay. And I started working with clay a lot, and I still do now. And now I'm a ceramicist, and who knew that was coming? But I just had to touch earth.
Mm.
It wasn't intellectual. It was this impulse to move my hands and to touch this like kind of quality. I can see retrospectively how soothing that was to my nervous system. So I started working with clay. That was the first thing that happened that I can remember. Um, Another thing that happened was I actually, interestingly enough, had a flight booked to Mexico City for Day of the Dead the day or the week after my dad died. It was timing. It was beautiful timing. And I went to that and was held in ritual and collective ritual in community. My mother
Mm.
is Mexican American, and so for me, that was a very meaningful experience to be held in a cultural context that was my own,
Mm.
to be soothed in ritual that was ancient, to call on the ancestors and whatever that meant to me, um, was so useful, so helpful to begin to see that experience that like however you understand that we're still here, we're recycled through, however, or whatever you understand that to be, that like death isn't finite or infinite, I mean, or like final. That's what I'm trying to say. Death isn't finite, that we live on in all of these ways. And that was such a beautiful reminder. And also, like, I was in this house, it was an Airbnb, but somehow I was in this big, beautiful blue house with these older women who were caring for me
Mm.
and who were like making me food and showing me their plant medicine. And I was just like, what kind of remarkable dream is this? And so it's just being held by a culture, and being held within ritual that was really, really old, and that had held so many people before me. And being held by music and rhythm. There was a lot of dancing that happened. There was a lot of like ceremonial dance. There was a lot of copal incense. There was a lot of lighting candles and doing the same thing actually for many, many days leading up to the end of the holiday. So, um, and there was, of course, food, which was amazing and nourishing. And yeah, it was a deep holding in that sense. So I learned a lot about ritual, and I learned about it a lot about what that means in the context of community, and everyone sort of being together there in their grief and how important that is. And that grief looks so different for different people, and that's all fine. And people were celebrating, which is phenomenal, and other people were crying, which is phenomenal, and they were all sort of having their own unique grief experience. Um, and then, continuing on, I think my really the thick of my grief process with my father was a full rounded out year. So I continued to work with the earth, and when I went for his memorial, I collected earth. I collected clay and I harvested it. Um, and I created bowls, gratitude bowls, out of the clay that I collected from my father's memorial in the place that he had lived and the place that I was born, which is native territory. And I took this land and I made these bowls, and the gratitude bowls now hold letters to my father,
Mm.
and remembrances of the things that he gave me in his lifetime. And we had a pretty tumultuous relationship, mind you. But I could start to see all of the ways that he had lived in me in some respect, but be it physically, or that he taught me a lot about the land, or that he taught me a lot about um, creating. and working with my hands. And so I could start to see all of these things as I was going through my grief process of all of the ways that he had still lived in each moment for me.
Mm.
And I use those bowls now as gratitude bowls if I want to talk to him or if I want to connect with him. Um, and then, I continued to go through that process, and there were a lot of feelings and a lot of parsing things out in that time, and a lot of like moving my body through rhythm or with clay, um, writing. And then, of course, after the year was ended, I actually met with a Cherokee elder, and my father was Cherokee. And I met with a Cherokee elder, and we did a meditation together and did
Mm.
a vision of my father. And he showed up in this incredible light and held me. So much of the tension that existed in our relationship was I didn't feel held by him. And so in this vision, he was holding me and he was just saying, I love you so much. There was this understanding that he didn't know how to do that in a body. But now that he is in his natural state, he can. And so I had this really full, rounded out experience that was so much carried by ritual, that was so much carried by rhythm, that was carried by wintering and staying in and creating and feeling and writing and then reaching out and being with people and talking when I needed that. So that is, I think, a really long-winded way of like demonstrating the way that ritual can carry us.
Mm.
And being in our natural tendency towards soothing and trusting our bodies to move into that naturally is such good medicine. Being in community is such good medicine.
It's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
I have all these memories of, as you were speaking, of how ritual has been a big part of my own journey with this. Um, and to maybe connect to some of the things you were drawing out about ritual, of how there is that natural sense of soothing. I think that we do move into as autistic folks. There's also, I was sort of pondering why is ritual so powerful, maybe particularly for autistic folks. And some of the things that came to mind were like that it's very symbolic. It doesn't have to be in a bunch of words. All, if the person is not necessarily like hyperlexic, but needs like this grounded way of
Yeah.
expressing.
Right,
Um,
right. It gives us some sense of some ground for which we can say goodbye.
yeah.
When my best friend died brutally, rather brutally, she was murdered many years ago, and her family didn't have a funeral for her. Um, that created so much unprocessed grief for me because I didn't get to say goodbye and I didn't get to do it in the holding field of a community. And that is really, really important. It's almost as if we live with a kind of grief that's unacknowledged.
Mm.
Uh, and we need our grief to be socially acknowledged.
I want to kind of ask you a little bit about that because, especially as autistic folks, like I don't want to generalize, but my experience has been that I'm not always that connected with people. I might not have a huge community,
Yeah.
um, and that was particularly painful during this time. My immediate family is not very connected, and so a lot of it fell on me um, to move through. But it was actually really important. Like I found that for me, it was a part of the grieving process to be the one that like took apart her home piece by piece, like in a very like
Yeah.
ritualistic way,
Hmm.
and like looked over her story, and like held space for that. Like it was, I think I was probably the only one that could have done it in our family. Um, and having to carry that more alone was very difficult. I'm just curious your thoughts around like how to maybe have bring in that community if people are more isolated sometimes.
Yeah. And I want to take a moment to just acknowledge the times that we're living in and how disconnected they are. Um, it's a real characteristic of white supremacy culture, again, is disconnection.
Mm.
Individual, being an individual, we be able to acknowledge or embody or actualize our interconnectedness. And so I see this very commonly in specifically in white family systems.
Yeah.
Um, People are left to grieve alone. I think it is why there are now so many organizations like the one that I'm running, community death care organizations generally, and death cafes, and other types of accessible grassroots grieving spaces that are coming up or showing up, because we are acknowledging that there is a need for this, that people are grieving alone and people are dying alone. Um, yes. And so, like, yes, there is a definite need for connection in this, and like to connect in a meaningful way. And some family systems are so intrinsically disconnected, unfortunately, um, that you can't bridge that gap. And to do so would actually like create more grief, likely, and create more pain. Um, so if you have a family system that you can approach and you can reach out to and ask for what you need, that's awesome. That's great. Maybe they may not be um, knowledgeable about how they can support a grieving process, but they'll be responsive. Sometimes that's enough. Um, and then sometimes there are family systems that just aren't, that are so fractured that they just can't show up in an attuned way. In which case, I think that's where you bring in your friends group, you bring in your partner's family if you have a partner, you bring in your children. I think
Mhm.
we move children out of grieving, which is so wild to me. Um, but we bring your children if you're, to the extent that it's age appropriate, and you reach out to communities that are grievers that want to grieve with you, like, the organization that I run and other
Yeah.
spaces that exist for like doing this work. Um, yeah. Did that answer the question?
I really appreciate that
Yeah.
because I don't want to relate that I did it completely on my own. I definitely had, especially my brother, very much a part of the process, who was the most close to my mother who had died. Um,
Just by
and then,
creating, I'm sorry. Go
what?
ahead.
Oh, and then a number of really key friendships were a huge part of that. One of which, particularly, is a person who can hold ritual really well, and was in the state that I was doing all this in, because I actually was away from my home for a number of
Yeah.
months moving through this. Um, and so, like, the element of ritual, because he's really amazing at holding that space and like working energetically and whatnot. And then all of that was really what has helped me to come to a solid place of where I am now.
Mhm.
Um, so I'm incredibly grateful for that, and I really appreciate that you helped to sort of expand on like do you that there's ways to connect, that you don't have to do that alone. Um, while recognizing the reality that the family systems might not be the place.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and
mhm.
even trying to pursue it could cause more rupture.
Yeah.
But like also like just by creating a ritual space,
Hmm.
like a memorial, for instance, uh, it can really invite the process of grieving together. People may not know how, but if you give them a container and you give them things to do within that container, sometimes they can show up for that.
Yeah.
And you named that like you weren't at home, you were somewhere else that was away from home, which was my experience with my father too, um, which definitely made it different. Definitely
Yeah.
hit like I didn't know what my resources were there, and I was sort of still trying to land in what that was. And some of the grief happened there. A lot of it happened at home, though.
Well, and I appreciate that too, like the because it comes back to what you said about the time frame, like letting it be what it is, and it might take more time, and it might involve different contexts. Like what as the person moves through their grieving process or with it. I don't know if there's a through, but there's a with, at least. Um, and yeah.
And I think I just had in mind, I just saw this image of this grief altar, this altar that I've had for a friend. I didn't grieve their death right away. They died in another country. I was not included in their funeral process. I didn't find out that they died until pretty late in the situation. Um, and so I didn't really get to grieve communally, um, and ended up grieving much later. Realized a few years later that was holding a tremendous amount of grief and pain around it. And I set
Mm,
up an altar for them, and I actually just now took it down like a few days ago. And that altar was a really important part of my process of grieving on my own. And then just having one point person that we both knew, um, that I could say every now and again, I remember him and I miss him.
mm, mm,
And they could reflect that back. I remember him too. I also miss him. Um, yeah, and that was enough when I finally could get in contact with it, the grief, and that there was a process that needed to happen to move it through my system, which doesn't mean it's ever truly gone, but it means it gets a chance to have its life. The grief can have its own life and move through me as it needs to until it is moved in whatever ways it needed to move. I felt that I just reached the culmination of that with this friend, and I could finally, I think I don't need this altar anymore. I looked at you every day on this altar. I thanked you every day on this altar. I remembered you every day on this altar.
mm.
I don't need to do this anymore. So altars have been historically so important in death and grief and in ritual and in spirituality that I think that they have an important place as well.
I love that.
And it could
Even
be
what we can do
simple,
for
like a
ourselves.
meal with a candle and a flower.
Yeah.
Yeah, it could be internal. I had a client I was working with who was grieving their dog, and they lived in, they were nomadic and they lived in a trailer, and that's, they were living their best life in that way, and the dog died in the process while they were out, um, by some mysterious incident, and um, they didn't have space for an altar, but they had a little box, and they would keep a picture and little things, little mementos in the box, and they would open the box whenever they needed to see that and grieve.
It reminds me of my mom kept journals, at least from around the time I was born, I think. And then I found all of them in her home and read a little bit of them, but like that was part of it too, of like having these little pieces to come back to. And but I will say too, because you mentioned about this like sort of spiritual connection, that I actually feel closer to her now. I feel like we even chat sometimes, and like there's an element of like connecting with a different version of her now that I didn't have access to before, and that's been
Yeah,
really beautiful. And
yeah,
that part of like you said before about like that death isn't like the end in a way, um, that's been really an important part of my own resilience in this process.
mhm.
I do also want to touch on what you wrote in regard to autistic folks being caregivers and lovers and healers and truth tellers.
Yeah.
I feel it's connected, but I do
Yeah,
you.
I actually do too. I first want to say absolutely on the connection feeling closer. Like I feel that
Yeah,
with my father. I feel closer to him now than I ever did before. The lines of communication are clear.
yeah, exactly.
Um, yes, something happened where the lines of communication felt clear, and I felt like he could hear me now in a way he couldn't before. Sometimes some bodies really have a hard time loving while they're here, loving in a way in which it can be received. So sometimes when we're not in a body, we're more in touch with that. Um, yes, autistic folks as caregivers. Yeah, I'm gonna sit with that for a second. We do it differently. We do it differently. That's the first thing I can say.
Well,
We definitely do
I
it differently.
think yes, exactly. Well, and I remember at the beginning part of what you wrote, you said you sort of touched on how there's like it can be a stereotype, that autistic folks can't hold space relationally or something like that. And I really appreciate that you were flipping that it will look different, but like that also it's a big part of even historically how autistic folks have contributed to communities. Um, so yeah, if you wanted to touch on any of that, I know I'm not asking a question. I'm sorry, it's not coming out as a question.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the spaciousness around it, actually. Uh, yeah, I guess I could start with just mentioning that I am a psychotherapist, and in that journey, I have worked in spaces with a lot of allistic femmes or women um, who had expectations for caregiving that were rooted in white supremacy culture, rooted in womanhood, white womanhood specifically. Um, and that came from a fairly ableist and holistic lens about who I was supposed to be and what care looks like. Um, I feel like there's so much to unpack in that. Like, what do they mean by that? Like, what is that? What does white womanhood look like? I was expected to, for instance, communicate in ways that were indirect and unclear for me. I tend to be a really direct, clear communicator. I try to be. Um, I don't actually know how to do it differently. I have tried it and it looks ridiculous because I'm trying to look like I have a lot of self-doubt in certain ways. That's the
And
method.
you're like, I'm searching.
Right. Apparently, that's how it's supposed to go, but I am not very good at it. I was never very good at masking, actually. I didn't even know I was supposed to be. Uh, I only realized this at some point fairly recently, and I was like, oh, I see. Let me try. And then it didn't really go down well. And I was like, that feels weird, and it feels like lying, and it feels bad in my body, and I can't do that. Um, no, I never knew to mask, actually. I guess some people get that message that to mask, but I never knew that I was supposed to be doing that. And so I would get really reprimanded in a lot of these spaces. I was told that I was too aggressive. I was told, what else? Mostly that I was too aggressive, or like misread as being aggressive. Um, I feel like there were some other ones, but that's the one that sticks out to me in this moment. Uh, I had internalized that in some ways, very at an unconscious level for most of it, the internalization of it. Um, yeah, and I just got some really awful messages about like me not being an adequate caregiver. Oh, my kids too. I have two kids. They're 16 and 20 or 19. I'm giving her a year. And you know, it's been really interesting to parent them because there's an open dialogue about my autism and one of my children is autistic as well. And so we're constantly in dialogue about our neurotypes and how that shows up. And there's a lot of grace around how I do parenting. And I get a lot of good feedback about how my autism actually works really well for my role as a parent. Um, because I don't have a lot of like gender for me as a social construct. And so because I don't have a lot of gender baggage, they didn't get a lot anyway either. I didn't have any expectations about who they were supposed to be as gendered beings. I didn't have a lot of I didn't project a lot onto them because I didn't actually fully understand it myself. I didn't project my unlived life onto them. So they were free to be whatever it is that they need to be. So there was a lot of space and freedom in how I provided care for them, and I think that shows up as a caregiver in other ways too, as a therapist. I'm very, very aware of social constructs. I'm very aware of the constructed nature of them, and
That's key.
it frees us up in a lot of ways,
Yeah.
and it makes space for a lot of possibility. What else can I say? I think, having an incredibly sensitive nervous system is a gift as a provider. Also very hard. It's a gift if I'm providing care in any capacity. Um, as my daughter says, it's a little bit creepy that you know exactly how I'm feeling. And I'm like, when I realized that I could feel everybody, that I had high affect empathy, even though my cognitive empathy was lower, my affect empathy was higher. Um, I don't understand it the way that you understand it, but I feel you through my system, and my system is incredibly sensitive. And that allows me to be with you more fully than I could ever be personally, cognitively. Um, and that allows me to name into the room what is alive that may be under your conscious awareness, under the level you're under, maybe too subtle for you to consciously detect. Um, so that is often such a useful instrument in terms of providing care for people. Just to say, well, it seems like you're really confused right now. So I'm noticing the feelings of confusion in my body as I've become more aware of my somatic experience. I can more clearly identify them in terms of language, which I think is a challenge point for a lot of autistic people. But I think it's just a matter of familiarity. Most of us don't want to get into our bodies. We don't want to get
Right.
lower in the body because we're
Mhm.
afraid of being blasted by intensity. We're kind of constantly trying to manage the intensity in our bodies. Um, Another thing that I think works really well as an autistic person who is a caregiver is I'm kind of self-soothing all the time. I am nourishing myself all of the time. And I'm not pretending like I'm not. And I'm not pretending like I need to be a different version of myself as a
Mhm.
caregiver than I am at any other time. So, what that looks like is it looks like me inviting people into my nourishment.
Mhm.
Instead of me showing up as this together version who is flawless, I'm showing up as this version who is stimming. And I'm like, want to stim with me? Like, you know,
Yes.
want to play with me? Want to meditate with me? Want to self-soothe with me? And more often than not, it is what people
Mhm.
need.
Oh,
It is an
yes.
invitation into nourishment. We are great at creating environments that are nourishing and holding. We're great at creating them for ourselves. We can invite people into that. There's this strange disconnection. Like, I don't know what it is that we were taught that caregivers are supposed to be some kind of, I don't know, like a person who
Clinical
is
or
not
something.
in the room fully or something. We're supposed to
Mm.
be able to play. I don't, maybe this comes from a, like a Freudian influence. We're supposed to be something other than whatever it is that we are.
Mm.
But what that actually does is it makes us show up in ways that are inauthentic, and the other person can feel that. And a person who's on their deathbed, they need authenticity more than they need anything else. They need you to be able to be real with them. They don't have time.
Yeah.
So if you can show up and be like, God, I'm hurting in this body right now. I'm feeling so overwhelmed. How you doing in that body? And they're like, me too, actually. And I was doing a training recently on conscious living and dying and how to be with people when they're dying. And one of the things that came up was, what about burnout? What about when our bodies are exhausted? I'm like, that will make you so much better at understanding what it is to be in a body that is hurting. And that will make
Mm.
you a much better provider for someone who is dying than feeling good all the time. You can use your own pain towards empathy and understanding the other person's pain. And you can even be in that pain and bring both nourishment to yourself and the other person through creating a nourishing field, not through handing them, here's nourishment, let me take care of you. But it's more like, let us take care of us. Let us be in relationship together in this beautiful, nourishing holding field. So
I'm
I
just
don't know
taking it. I'm taking it in.
went off on a tangent.
No. I just. I want to like bask in that for a second. I just.
Yeah.
That was
We don't
incredibly
have to
beautiful.
be together. We're not together. We could
Mm.
never be together. We're not here for that.
Mm.
We're here to be messy human beings wherever we are in our experience and process. And I think this sense of this to being together or not being messy is a very sort of, again, white supremacy culture sort of characteristic of, perfectionism. We have to show up in this perfected version of myself to be the caregiver. Maybe just be the human. Make it up.
Revolutionary thought.
Just be with whatever is. Because people who are dying, guess what they're doing? They're learning to be with whatever is. That's what conscious dying is.
Mm.
Kind of going, okay. to whatever it is that's arising in your field in that moment. This is how it is. Okay. And lean.
Especially in the vulnerability of that moment, right? Where there's no more pretense.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
is the end of this version of you, your body. And you like you were saying, you have to be there.
Yeah.
This is it.
And
And
this is
as someone who, oh, I'm sorry, keep talking. I love all of it.
in any capacity, like any, like as any caregiver, if we're talking about death and dying, if we're talking about therapy or whatever, um, leaning into how it all is so that the other person can lean into how it all is too. So you're modeling that. Yeah, I know. Yeah, you're right. At the end of our lives, like we just don't have time for it. We don't have time for anything else. We don't have space for anything else. And I think people get really real when they're dying. A lot of people, not all people, but they kind of go, I don't have fucking time for games. I don't have time for pretending for you. I don't have time to pretend like I'm doing all right. I'm in
Right.
pain. I'm in pain. This is hard. Hold me.
Yeah.
Hold me with your, your own field of okayness. Here it is. Here we are. Yeah.
I really appreciate what you were saying too about your own journey with not even knowing to mask. I think I had a bit of an opposite experience personally where I definitely did try really hard until until I understood my own self and have let that go. But I was almost visualizing as you were talking about being the caretaker in that moment of how it's like this call that not only are you unmasking, but to see like the beauty in the authentic versus because there's so much, at least for folks that get the message to mask, that like there's so much pressure to like get away from that and that this is not appropriate or whatever. And so it was such a beautiful, in my mind, it's invitation I'm hearing you say of really leaning into that as part of the healing gift or like the gift that's your being in that moment.
Mhm, mhm,
Um,
mhm. Yeah,
Beautiful.
and if I track that, I'm just thinking about, why didn't I ever mask? And I think for me, like, again, being in a really sensitive body, uh, I could feel the pain of disconnection in masking or in trying to be whoever it is people needed me to be. And I could only faintly sense like you have some expectation. Uh, and I could probably have leaned into that or like sussed that out if I was invested, but I was never invested in other people's expectations, really. It felt bad in my body. I could feel that, like, oh, that expectation doesn't feel great. My tendency was actually to push back against the expectation and to want to listen deeply to what it is that felt authentic to me, because that felt more connective and soothing to my nervous system, soothing to my body than masking or meeting someone's expectation. I could feel like a real visceral disconnection, like the feeling of disconnect.
Yeah.
Um, and that, like, I could feel in my body the difference between fitting in and belonging very strongly.
Ooh.
And I could almost always sooner be alone than to fit in
Mm-hmm.
because I could feel a lot of belonging in my own company
Yeah.
and in my own relationship to myself. So that was like, if I get into my own psychology about it early on, I think that that was sort of how my process was and how my inner experience was that preserved that part well enough that I grew to understand its value socially. And a lot of that understanding its value socially comes from both doing death care work where people are at the end of their lives and they just like are like, listen, I need realness,
Mm-hmm.
and also working with people who um, are on the fringes of society in some way or are starting to let go of the ways that they've masked both holistic and autistic people and other types of neurodivergent people. Everyone I work with as a psychotherapist sort of falls into that space of people who are unmasking themselves in some way,
Mm-hmm.
or who have suffered the consequences of not being masked. Um, and who really want to step into authenticity more fully. And I have just learned just this week that at least two of my clients have started working with me initially because of what I look like, which I think is hilarious. And I was told, as I was starting my career, that I couldn't be a highly tattooed person and have a career as a therapist. Uh,
Mhm.
and quite the opposite is what's actually happened. My clients are like, no, your tattoos signal to me authenticity and that you are walking your talk.
Mm.
And that feels safe to me. So I feel I'm like this visible, embodied representation of authenticity for a lot of people. And it is true. Like there's really something to walk around the world with a face tattoo. Like to be a therapist with a face tattoo. Um, it is really something, but I kind of had a laugh about it earlier this week. I was like, oh, I win. Like they told me forever, I didn't listen to them and did whatever I wanted to do and just was being so true to myself. And I win. Because I'm almost always full with
You
my
win and we
that's
win.
my
So
win. Huh?
I said you win and we win. We
Yeah.
being everybody that gets to experience you. And so I'm really grateful that you have being this way. You are being you. That's
Yeah, I'm so committed. I am still
yeah.
so committed to just listening deeply for that inner voice and
Mm.
following it out and being really, really loyal to my own internal compass and listening
Mm.
for whatever I need to do and however it is I need to move in a given moment.
Well, I would love to ask you too, like, um, about being someone who has created your own practice. Um, and especially because you had mentioned earlier about like really in your body experiencing other people's emotions or however you want to describe them, the energy of what's happening, and I similarly have kind of felt that as well. Um, but I would love to hear from you, like what helps you with the fact that you are so sensitive in being able to like run your practice with these things that are very deep, very powerful moments in life. Um,
Yeah. How do I take care of myself? I kind of like
yeah,
think
that's
mentally.
the question.
I take care of myself by creating a nourishing environment in the therapeutic space. Again, like I'm bringing my nourishment with me. I'm not leaving it somewhere. I'm not going to get to it later. Um, it's in the room. Sometimes that means I have to slow down when I'm speaking. I do intentional self-touch, so I'll put my hand over my chest just to get in contact with my body. Um, I only work 3 days a week. It's a really practical, helpful
Yeah,
aspect. I see
nice.
clients 3 days a week, and I take 4 days to usually a 24-hour just to like rest. Oh, I let myself sleep in a lot. That's one of the things that I do in the mornings. I sort of see people later in the day typically, so that I can let my body wake up naturally at its own time.
Mhm.
I notice that my body needs a lot more rest than most people's. Who are you? I don't even know who these most people are, but I assume it seems like I do need a lot of sleep. Um, yeah, so I schedule till later into the day. Mostly create systems that work for my particular body. And again, like I'm sort of always listening for what that is and how I need to move in a given moment. I really like rhythm. Uh, uh, in my life. So my life will tend to look fairly the same each week. I am the most boring human being on the planet about food during the week, especially the days that I'm working. I don't really care what I eat, and I will eat the same thing over and over, and that helps me greatly because I don't have to think a lot about like what I'm going to cook that night after a long day of sessions. So I keep it very simple on the days that I work, especially. Um, I take a bath in the evening, almost religiously. I take a bath. That is one way that I soothe my nervous system and care for myself. What else do I do? I mean, there's so many things. It's all like really baked into my life. Before I come into this spaces where I do sessions, I light a candle. I say good morning to my ancestors. I bring them into the therapy room with me, and this is something I learned from an indigenous teacher who's a psychotherapist. He was working with other indigenous people. And early in his career, and learned that they were bringing their ancestors in, and that there was really no way for him to work with them if he wasn't going to work with the ancestors. And
Mm.
after a while, of course, he started bringing his own ancestors. And so it was this like, realizing the value of ancestor practice within psychotherapy. So I greet my ancestors when I come in. I can't do this work alone, and I don't. So
Oh,
uh,
I
they're
love
always
that.
in the room supporting. What else? I'm very open and honest with my clients, both about being autistic, and just also just about being a real human being. I never ask them to hold that for me per se, but it does mean that if something comes up and it's a particularly autistic thing that arises, I will let them know. Oh, I think I did a very autistic thing there. Just so you know, most of my clients are also autistic, so they get it, and I probably don't have to make that kind of announcement. But when I'm working with holistic people, they may not realize that. Uh,
Mm.
Sometimes I'll lose access to language, for instance, when I'm very tired. In general, I have a hard time finding words. This has happened more as I've gotten older. Uh, Writing is very easy for me to find language, but somehow in spoken format, it's harder. So I will have to tell my clients, "Oh, I'm losing language." Sometimes I'll have to tell them, um, just so they know what's happening in the field. I come from a place where I think that everything that's happening in the relational field is medicine. So it's all workable and usable. Sometimes I may not tell them and I might just like shift how I'm moving in the space and just open the space more for them to fill it. So there are just so many different ways that are peppered into my work and my life in terms of how I nourish and care for myself. I think those are, and I have a very full art practice. I'm looking at my clay work right here. So I'm like, I have a very full art practice that I'm committed to and used to sometimes even do art after sessions or in between sessions. Oh yeah, I'll even show you what I do here. This is just stuff I do in between my sessions.
Ooh.
This is what, stimming in art looks like.
Oh, I love that.
Just repetitive lines. And I do that in between sessions and it soothes my nervous system. So it's just all baked into how I am and how I move in the world. And I'm uncompromising in my authenticity and
Have
in
you always been? Or is this, I mean, you kind of have said that this has been more of your natural way of being. I was
yeah,
going to say,
and more so over the years. Like it used to
yeah,
kind of be like, I'm gonna do this. I'm really sorry. Now it's like, I'm just gonna like this is how it is. Okay.
yeah, like
A big
more
part of
solid.
yeah, it's a little more like, yeah, it's not apologetic anymore. Which is
Mm.
not to say that I definitely don't hear feedback or fairly
Yeah.
flexible as a person um, and really try to move with what is emergent and to be responsive accordingly, which is actually a strategy for me to actually manage overwhelm as
Mm.
much as a way of being in tune with the whole world as a living organism and in relationship to it. So both of those things feel true. And I feel that, the more I connect with indigenous ways of moving and the more I connect with like ancient ways of moving, the more I find that like ways of soothing our nervous system and caring for ourselves have been intrinsic to most cultures throughout the world and throughout time. And we've kind of lost that, I think, in the European and Europeanly influenced societies, and in the United States and the West, in many respects, we've kind of lost contact with that. So the more I kind of lean into that, the more I feel held and soothed in every aspect of my life, no matter what I'm doing.
If you were to maybe offer suggestion to folks who maybe are at the beginning of that journey, what would you say would like helps them to maybe move into that space of being more maybe aware, authentic, unapologetic?
Mm. The gap between what we want, what we believe, our values, and our embodiment is practice. So find just one or two practices that help you get there and commit and do them and engage with that. And be in community too with people who are doing that.
Mm.
It's easy to fall off of practice when we don't have a community of practitioners doing the same practices.
I appreciate what you said about the values. So even becoming more aware of what it is that really matters to you.
Yeah, if authenticity is a value of yours, it seeds into your body.
And I love to, like, sometimes I've mentioned to folks that even just the acknowledging internally can be a starting place. Like, if it is uncomfortable to be expressing that, at that moment, but starting even with, like, oh, I can tell I don't like this, or I do like this, like, but you're acknowledging it to yourself as a way of is stepping in that direction.
Yeah, definitely increasing our awareness, expanding our kind of internal spaciousness so that we can really see and perceive our experience. Uh,
Mm.
like, oh, that feels, I mean, like I was referencing kind of quite a few times, it's like it didn't feel good in my body. It
Right.
didn't feel good in my body to feel disconnected through masking or through engaging in whatever people, however people expected me to behave. It felt stressful. And I respect that. I have learned this was a really hard one for me. I kept a whole journal for a year about this. It was called, the body journal, and it was all about a year of listening to my body and learning to trust it.
Mm.
And it was scary. And in the beginning of the journal, it's like, can I really trust this? Like, this is scary. If I just listen to and respect everything my body says, like, could that lead me into a bad direction? And it's really a study on getting to know your body, listening to the call. What is that call? The more you listen, the more you get to know all of its little subtle nuances. This is an alarm bell going off because it reminds me of a relationship I had once. And so, like, that feels clear. And this is an alarm bell going off because this is someone I have misaligned values with that I don't want to move towards. And those are very different things, right? And like in your body, the more you listen to your body, the more information you can get from it about this circumstance you find yourself in, and it gives really good information. It is literally there to help protect you and help you navigate the world. Um, it's an incredibly attuned system if you listen to it. And again, like I want to address that like fear that we listen to it and we respect it, um, that will become overwhelmed by it. Um, And I just think that we have so much capacity for holding intrinsically, um, and for being with. And it's often the things that we're not with that we abandon that end up causing us suffering, not the things we turn towards, which is a very Buddhist line of thinking.
But there's a big difference between pain and suffering. Like, we might be turning towards pain, but that's a lot different than suffering.
Right, right. There's an analogy of the first dart and the second dart in Buddhism, and they say the first dart is pain. It's what happened. Ah, I
Mm.
felt rejected. you know. They said that thing and I felt rejected. And the second dart is suffering, and it's the spin-off of pain. When we get into a whole story, and at that point, when we're in the spin-off, we've actually turned away from the first dart. We're no longer with ourselves. We've self-abandoned. And we're in story, and we're not even attached to our bodies anymore. We're up here, and we're actively in suffering. Uh, And so, really, we minimize our suffering greatly when we turn towards the aliveness of the moment.
I love that there was power in that statement. So I'm just letting it be. I feel like there's so many things I want to talk about, but I know we're coming towards the end of our time, and I want to respect that. I really, really appreciate you being here and sharing and being you in this moment of sharing. Um, where can there's just one actual last thought that keeps coming to mind that I feel like is connected to that conversation around unmasking, if that's something that folks want to do. Because I had mentioned how I previously, or I've had times when I've been very isolated or disconnected from people. And one thing I've found with my own journey of unmasking is that part of that came from what you were even describing is that it's kind of a lie, right? And a lie feels very uncomfortable if you're showing up with a mask, and that was a big part of I think what would keep me isolated sometimes is that I was so uncomfortable that I would just rather be alone. And I found now as I do that less and less, that it's actually a lot easier to be connected because there isn't this huge discomfort in trying to lie. So just wanted to like follow that up there. But now that we've come towards the end of this conversation, and there's just so much here, and that I hope people have connected with, and maybe connected with you. Like, where can they find you? What ways can people connect with you and your work? If you wouldn't mind sharing.
Yeah. So the Letting Go project is the death care work that I do. We're at thelettinggoproject.org. So that's the website. We also have Instagram that I'm terrible at managing, but it's the letting, what is it? The underscore letting go project.
I'll have it in the description.
It's similar. And then, and then my psychotherapy work is liberation therapy, at liberationtherapist.com. And then I actually do manage the profile, the social media profiles for that a little bit better, which I guess there will be some information somewhere on that. But yeah, also found on through my website, you can find the blog and some of my writing, and then on the death care website, you can find our events and stuff like that. Yeah. And then
Wonderful.
also, like, people should connect if they want to create community death care where they are. Like,
Mm.
there's no reason. We know how to tend to our dying intrinsically. We just do. We do. Um, so like, if people want to find out how to create that kind of grassroots organizing of sorts to support people who are dying in their communities, I would be more than open to talking about that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know how to end this, but I guess we're over for now. Everyone ends the conversation like this because it's so alive that it's hard to say it's over. But
Yeah.
for this moment, it is, and I really appreciate all those who have listened. And we will be back here again soon. Editing, Jennilee here. We actually were not done with the conversation yet. So we had kept talking for a little bit and we decided to hit record. So here's just a couple more minutes from Zero. And I wanted to include this because they have just everything they've said in this conversation is amazing. And I really hope to have them back again because there's just so much more that they touched on that we weren't able to get to. And I hope we do in the future.
As you unmask, as you grow into your authenticity, as you learn who you are and move accordingly, who is available to you shrinks. Your world shrinks.
Mm.
But the people who are available to you, you can go deeper with.
Yeah.
And this is like, I wish this was talked about a lot more because I end up experiencing this with people I work with, and they're like, "Oh my God, I don't have these friends anymore, and I'm grieving all this loss, and nothing else is showing up in its place, or it's really hard to navigate who my people are now, and to know who they are, and to know how to find them." And I'm like, yeah, it's a slow, patient process, and there are fewer people. But those few are golden. Those few will take you so much deeper into yourself than the many ever could.
And it really is what I think people are looking for, especially
Mhm,
the autistic person.
mhm, mhm.
That even if it's fewer, it is actually what you were looking for.
Yeah, it's real. It's
Yeah.
real. Yeah, even if it's fewer, it's real. And the more you become that, the easier it will be to identify. Yeah. So our people are out there, they're out there. They're just harder to find. They're all at home.
Yeah.
Choosing, authenticity over fitting in, but also trying to figure out how to find us.
Right, right. If you can find us in our little rooms. No, but
Yep.
you said early on the difference between fitting in and belonging, and it was one of those moments where I was like, yeah, I was like, yes, I can feel it. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, I just
But I find them in places like, in my Zen community. I find them in um, In death care communities.
Yeah.
I find them in communities of people who are deconstructing their gender or other identities. I find them in places having difficult conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or in places not talking at all, listening deeply to how it all is. Yeah, they're out there.
Thank you.
Mhm.